Usually when we look at history, we think of it as just a series of events, wars, treaties, inventions, that kind of thing.
Right, the standard textbook stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you really want to understand how the modern world was built, you actually have to look at the VIP ropes.
Oh, the ultimate exclusive club. And, I mean, the bouncers at this club, they were heavily armed, they legally owned the building, and they claimed God personally put them at the door.
Yeah, that is a perfect way to put it. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are pulling apart a massive stack of notes based on the Wikipedia article on the ultimate VIP list, which is nobility.
And this is such a fascinating topic because, we're not just looking at guys in shiny crowns here.
Right.
This was a massive global system of resource allocation, intense gatekeeping, and just raw power that fundamentally shaped the world you live in today.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is nobility? Because at its core, the source material defines it as a social class that normally ranks just below royalty.
Yeah, right below the king or queen.
Right, and it was historically granted by a monarch or a government, and almost always hereditary, meaning you're born into it.
Yeah, and to really understand how this shapes the world, we kind of have to look at the root of the word itself. It derives from the Latin word nobilis.
Which means what exactly?
It simply meant well-known or notable. I mean, if we go all the way back to ancient Rome, the nobles were really just an informal designation.
Okay, so not like a strict legal thing yet.
Exactly. It applied to families who had an ancestor that reached the consulship. So at that point, it was largely about political achievement and allied interest rather than some strict legal caste that you were permanently locked into.
But then, the Roman Empire falls apart, and we fast forward to the feudal system in Europe. And that informal respect hardens into a very specific binding trade.
A very serious contract.
Yeah, a contract. It was basically protection in exchange for service.
Yeah.
Nobles held fiefs, which could be tracts of land or even a specific office under vassalage.
Precisely. Under vassalage, they provided direct military service to a suzerain.
A suzerain being a higher-ranking noble, or the monarch, right?
Right, exactly. So if the king goes to war, you, as a noble, are legally obligated to show up. You have to bring a certain number of men, a certain number of horses.
You can't just opt out.
No, absolutely not. And in exchange for carrying the heavy military burden, they became this hereditary caste with just staggering, almost unimaginable privileges.
I was reading the list of these privileges in our notes, and honestly, it sounds like a high-stakes protection racket.
Oh, totally.
Like a really violent subscription service. Just imagine you are a medieval peasant. You give up your labor, a huge portion of your annual crop yield, and your cash rents.
Basically everything you produce.
Yeah, and in return, the local lord promises not to let rival armies burn down your farm.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, those privileges weren't just, nice bonuses for the elite. They were structural necessities designed to maintain the hierarchy.
How so?
Well, think about the logistics of being a medieval knight. Armor, war horses, weapons, these things were astronomically expensive, and the training took years.
Right, you can't just pick up a sword on the weekend.
Exactly. If a noble had to farm his own land, he just couldn't be a full-time warrior. So the system had to legally force the peasantry to support him.
Which explains the insane tax breaks they got. Like in France, nobles were completely exempt from paying the major direct tax.
The tail.
Yes. The tail, just zero taxes for the richest guys around.
And the rationale they used for that was that the commoners paid taxes with their money, while the nobles paid their tax with their blood on the battlefield.
Wow.
Yeah. But the perks went way beyond just dodging taxes. I mean, nobles held the exclusive right to hunt. And crucially, this wasn't just economic power we're talking about, it was legal power.
Oh, right, the private courts.
Yes. Peasants were often subject to the nobles' private courts and private police forces.
Private police. They literally were the law. I mean, if you had a dispute with your local lord, you had to go to a court that was owned and operated by that exact same local lord.
Completely rigged. And in some parts of Europe, the right of private war was actually a long-standing legal privilege of every noble.
Wait, private war? Like they could just declare war on each other?
Oh, yeah. If two dukes had a disagreement, they could legally raise armies and just fight each other in the countryside. But here's the catch to all this power. Nobles were strictly forbidden from doing manual labor.
Or like subordinating themselves to anyone of lower ranks.
Exactly. Doing so would be a derogation, basically a degrading of their noble status. They could literally lose their nobility.
So they were kind of trapped by their own prestige. They had to live, quote-unquote, nobly, which meant surviving solely off the proceeds of their estates to project that power.
It was a very expensive lifestyle to maintain.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because when the perks are that massive, no taxes, private courts, hunting rights naturally, everyone wants in.
Of course they do.
And the people who are already inside the club have to build these massive, impossible walls to keep the newly rich out.
It was obsessive gatekeeping. I mean, truly obsessive. And the language we still use today actually reflects that exact defensive posture. Take the phrase blue blood.
See, I always just assumed that was a metaphor, like a poetic way to say someone is fancy or expensive or elite.
A lot of people think that, but it's surprisingly literal. The English idiom is directly translated from the Spanish phrase sangre azul. According to the historian Robert Lacey in our source material, the Spanish nobility really took shape around the 9th century. These were warriors on horseback, and they were slowly clawing back the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish occupiers.
Like the Reconquista.
Exactly. Because these nobles claimed pure Visigothic descent, a nobleman would literally hold up his sword arm to display the blue veins visible beneath his pale, untanned skin.
Wait, hold up. So it was an actual physical demonstration, like, look at my arm.
Yes, literally holding up their arms. It was them saying, look at my skin, I don't work in the fields, and my lineage isn't mixed with the enemy.
That is wild.
It was literal proof to them. They believed a dark-skinned ancestor would muddy those veins. So showing prominent blue veins was proof of an uncontaminated birth.
Because the working class, the agricultural peasants, they spent all their time outdoors.
Right, they were tanned, their veins just didn't show as prominently, so blue blood wasn't poetry at all. It was a physical, visual marker of class separation.
That is intense. And over in France, they had their own version of extreme gatekeeping. But instead of veins, it was all about how old your money was.
The sword versus the roe.
Exactly. The old nobility of knightly origin, the noblesse d'épée, or nobility of the sword, they deeply, deeply resented the wealthy bourgeois who were being ennobled by the king.
Yeah, they called those newcomers the noblesse de robe, the nobility of the robe, because these were wealthy commoners who essentially bought their way into the nobility by acquiring administrative or judicial offices from the monarchy.
So they just bought the title.
Pretty much. And the old sword nobility saw them as absolute imposters.
It's basically old money versus new money, but with actual swords.
Well,
And to keep these newcomers, these parvenus, out of the most prestigious court positions, the old nobility created this barrier called the seize courtiers.
the 16 quarterings of noble ancestry,
Yeah, 16 quartering.
which, if you think about it, is a mathematical nightmare to prove. It means demonstrating that all 16 of your great-great-grandparents were noble.
All 16.
All of them. Think about that family tree. 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents.
And if even one of them was a commoner.
If even one of those 16 people was, say, a wealthy merchant instead of a titled noble, the chain is broken and you are totally disqualified.
Imagine you're trying to apply for a mortgage today, right?
Well,
But instead of pulling your credit score, the bank demands perfect, state-verified aristocratic birth certificates for all 16 of your great-great-grandparents.
you'd never get the house.
Never. It's an impossible VIP club dress code, and it was deliberately designed to humiliate anyone who just got rich yesterday. But wait, how do they even prove that in a world without digital records?
They relied incredibly heavily on heraldry. So the official tracking of coats of arms and extensive church baptismal records, heralds were basically the auditors of the medieval world.
The accountants of bloodlines.
Basically, yeah. They would physically inspect family trees, and if someone was caught forging a document to fake one of those 16 quarterings, it meant catastrophic social ruin. You were done.
Which highlights a crucial distinction the source material makes. High socioeconomic status is not the same thing as nobility.
Not at all.
You could be incredibly wealthy, swimming in gold, but if you couldn't prove those 16 quarterings, you weren't legally noble. And conversely, you could be completely broke, but your pedigree legally shielded your status.
Yes, the concept of the poor nobleman is as old as nobility itself. Aristocratic families lost their fortunes all the time. Bad harvests, bad gambling habits, losing a war.
Just terrible financial decisions.
Right. But because nobility was a legal status of blood, a broke duke was still a duke. He still legally outranked the richest merchant in the city.
Okay, so if blood was the ultimate currency in Europe, what happens in a society where, say, religion is the ultimate currency? Did nobles there have to play a different game?
Absolutely. The sources look globally too, and Ethiopia is a brilliant example of this. Ethiopia has an incredibly ancient nobility, and their aristocracy was divided into two distinct categories.
Okay, what were they?
You had the Mesiphint, which were the hereditary princes who formed the upper echelon, and then the Mekwanin, who were appointed governors and formed the bulk of the nobility.
So how did you move up in a system like that if you weren't born at the very top?
Through religious alignment, there's a fascinating historical case from the 1800s involving a noble named Michael of Wallo.
Michael of Wallo.
He was originally a Muslim noble in a country where the ancient Christian aristocratic families held the real, entrenched power. So to gain acceptance and power among that elite, Michael converted to Christianity.
I'm guessing that was a very strategic spiritual awakening.
Extremely strategic, and it worked spectacularly. By aligning his religion with the dominant power structure, he was made Negus, or king of Wollo.
Just from converting.
Well, converting and playing the politics right, he became king of Zion, and he even married into the imperial family. His son actually inherited the Ethiopian throne in 1913.
That's incredible. So he plays the religious game perfectly and just secures the throne for his bloodline.
Well, temporarily, what's fascinating here is that the son was actually deposed just 3 years later in 1916.
Oh, wow. Why?
Because he allegedly converted back to Islam.
Are you kidding me?
Nope. It perfectly demonstrates how, in Ethiopia, your noble status and your political survival were just inextricably tied to the dominant state religion.
So we have Europe obsessed with bloodlines and Ethiopia weaving in religious conformity. But what about societies that didn't rely on strict bloodlines or religion? I'm looking at the notes on China, and it seems like they flipped the script completely.
They really did. Though initially, during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, China had a feudal system that was actually very similar to Europe's. Emperors bestowed titles and fiefs of land.
Right.
They even gave noble titles to the descendants of dynasties they had personally overthrown.
Wait, what? Why would an emperor do that? Why give land and power to the family of the guy you just defeated in a war?
I know it sounds counterintuitive, but it was deeply tied to their cultural practices. They ennobled the descendants of overthrown dynasties specifically so those descendants could continue to offer the proper sacrifices to their ancestors.
Oh, to keep the spiritual balance.
Exactly. Disrupting the spiritual order was seen as highly dangerous. But the massive shift happens gradually, culminating in the Sui and Song dynasties. Power shifted entirely away from a hereditary bloodline nobility and toward a centralized bureaucracy.
Based on the imperial examination system. Which honestly is wild to think about. It's like a massive family business realizing the heirs are totally incompetent, firing all of them, and replacing them with hired MBAs who actually had to pass a grueling test.
That is a perfect analogy. China basically decoupled governance from pure genetics. The governance of the empire became the responsibility of Confucian-educated scholar officials.
So you had to study your way to the top.
Yeah, for male citizens, you could advance your social and political status by garnering top positions in these imperial examinations. Men would sit in tiny, isolated cells for days, just writing complex essays.
And if you passed, you essentially ran the country.
Exactly. The old noble titles still existed, but they became merely symbolic honorifics with a state stipend. They had no real political power anymore. China essentially created a different kind of elite, a literati gentry based on educational merit, rather than counting how many aristocratic great-great-grandparents you had.
Although I have to throw in this detail from the notes because it absolutely blew my mind. There was one major exception to this rule.
Oh, the Duke Yansheng.
Yes. The oldest continuously held noble title in Chinese history belonged to the descendants of Confucius. Even as they moved to this intense exam passing system, they kept that one specific bloodline revered and legally protected all the way until the Republic of China renamed the title in 1935.
Which just goes to show that even in a highly structured bureaucratic meritocracy, the cultural weight of ancestry never fully disappears. People still really crave that connection to the past.
So we have all these parallel systems of elite power developing around the world: blood, religion, education. But what happens when an expanding, rigid European nobility crashes right into an established indigenous nobility?
It's colonial collision.
Exactly. Like when European nobles started colonizing the globe, did they just wipe out the local VIPs to take their place?
You would naturally think so, but look at the Spanish in the Philippines. It is a stunning case study of this collision. The Philippines had their own indigenous nobility known as the Datus.
Right, local chieftains.
Yeah. And when the Spanish Empire annexed and Christianized the islands, you might expect them to eradicate those local power structures. But in 1594, King Philip II explicitly ordered that these indigenous rulers retain their honors and privileges.
They coalesced into a ruling class called the Principalia, and the Spanish crown actually equated these Filipino chiefs with the hidalgos, the nobles back in Castile.
It was a massive deal.
They were given the title Don or Doña, which was a huge mark of esteem. Try to picture this for a second.
Yeah.
You have a Spanish provincial governor representing the most powerful empire on earth at the time, legally allowing an indigenous Filipino chief to sit inside his home as an equal.
And Spanish priests were strictly forbidden from treating them with disrespect.
But I have to push back on Spain's motives here based on the sources. Was this genuine cross-cultural respect? Or was this just a really cynical administrative hack?
What do you mean?
Like, we don't want to send over thousands of expensive Spanish bureaucrats to run these 7,000 islands, so let's just co-opt the local bosses, give them fancy titles, and let them collect the taxes for us.
Well, it was absolutely a pragmatic integration. When the conquistador Miguel López de Legazpi arrived, he demanded vassalage to the Spanish crown. But in return, the local nobles got to keep their domains.
A trade-off.
Exactly. But it actually went much deeper than just local administration. Because the Spanish crown legally recognized their nobility, Filipino nobles were admitted to Spanish military academies.
Because to get into those academies, you had to prove you were noble.
Yes. The General Military Archive in Segovia actually holds service records showing that the descendants of Filipino chieftains met the strict nobility requirements of the Spanish military.
Wow.
It was a true merging of two parallel systems of elite power. Spain recognized that incorporating the indigenous nobility rather than fighting them was really the only viable way to maintain control over the archipelago.
Okay, so if this global system of nobility was so entrenched, so pragmatic, and so legally protected, whether you're a Datu in the Philippines, a Mesafin in Ethiopia, or a Duke in France, how did it fall apart?
Two massive societal earthquakes, essentially, crippled the nobles' monopoly on violence and wealth. The military revolution and the industrial revolution.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does a revolution in the military end a social class?
Well, think about the introduction of reliable gunpowder and centralized taxation. For centuries, the noble knight in heavy plate armor was the ultimate weapon on the battlefield.
Basically a human tank.
Exactly. But suddenly, a monarch can use state taxes to buy thousands of cheap muskets, hand them to untrained peasant infantry, and those peasants can shoot right through a noble's incredibly expensive armor.
Oh, man. So the training and the armor didn't matter anymore.
Right. As nations began creating cohesive, standing national armies, nobles lost their primary function, which was raising and commanding private armies.
They lost their monopoly on violence?
Yes.
And then the Industrial Revolution comes for their wallets.
Exactly. For 1,000 years, land was the only real source of wealth. Nobles owned the land. But suddenly, you have the rise of factories, global shipping, massive urban centers.
The bourgeois merchants.
Yeah. A wealthy city merchant who owns a textile mill suddenly has significantly more liquid cash than a rural nobleman whose wealth is tied up in wheat fields and stagnant rents.
The economic center of gravity just physically shifted away from them.
Yeah.
And the raw numbers of these nobles before this fall were wild, and they varied so much by country.
The statistics are fascinating.
Yeah, like in 18th century Poland, the Szlachta, their nobility made up 15% of the entire population.
Huge percentage.
Huge. In Spain, it was around 7 or 8%. In France, right before the revolution, it was barely 1%. But then you look at Britain, in 1707, there were only 168 English peers and 154 Scottish ones. That is a tiny, tiny fraction of the population.
And yet that exceptionally small British peerage dominated the government until the middle of the 19th century. But across the Western world, particularly after World War I, hereditary nobility entitled to special legal rights was largely abolished. The consensus just shifted. Society decided that inherited legal privilege was intrinsically discriminatory, and that individual meritocracy was a far more efficient way to allocate societal resources.
So what does this all mean? Did they really lose? Because I look at the modern remnants in our sources, and I'm not so sure.
You're looking at the British real estate, aren't you?
Yes. The UK House of Lords still has 92 hereditary peers voting on laws today. And more than a third of British land is still in the hands of aristocrats and traditional landed gentry. So did they lose, or did they just quietly rebrand while keeping all the real estate?
This raises a really important question, and it points to a profound shift in how power operates today. The shift was from legal privilege to social privilege.
Okay, unpack that.
Today, a duke in a European monarchy has no more legal privileges than a decorated citizen in a republic. They cannot demand a portion of your crops, and they certainly can't subject you to their private court. But they retain immense symbolic capital.
Symbolic capital. That actually perfectly explains the surviving cultural markers we still see globally in the notes. Like in Nigeria, where traditional rulers whose titles are centuries old continue to serve as privy counselors.
Yes.
And they're highly influential in modern politics, even without formal constitutional power. Or Bolivia. In 2007, the Bolivian government officially recognized the Afro-Bolivian king.
Yes, the titular ruler of the Afro-Bolivian community. He is the direct descendant of an old African tribal monarchy that was brought to Bolivia as enslaved people.
Wow.
His family has provided leadership to their community ever since that horrific event, and that cultural weight, that profound symbolic capital, is now officially recognized by the modern state. It shows how the cultural expectation of leadership survives even without the feudal legal structures.
We've covered incredible ground today. From the bloody protection racket origins of the feudal system to the logistical nightmare of proving 16 quarterings of ancestry.
The mortgage application from hell.
Exactly. We've seen how China replaced bloodlines with exams, how Spain co-opted Filipino chieftains to save on administrative costs, and how the modern echoes of this system still own a third of British land. It is a system that once dictated the lives of everyone on Earth.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it leaves us with something critical to reflect on. The source material shows us that the core of nobility wasn't just wearing a crown or holding a title.
Right.
It was the ingrained expectation of deference from those below you.
The expectation of deference.
As legal titles have vanished in most of the Western world, leaving you with a final question, have we truly eliminated the noble class? Or have we just replaced the 16 quarterings of ancestry with new, invisible metrics of prestige?
Oh, that's a good point.
If you look at the overlapping networks of elite universities, tech billionaires, and legacy media, you might want to ask yourself, in our modern meritocracy, who is quietly expecting your deference today?